Good morning. We're just about to start. Thank you for joining us, folks on the phone.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to call to order the June 7th, it's June already, Growth Management Policy Board meeting to order. It's great to see everybody, and I'm really excited for our meeting today and our discussion. The meat of our meeting is what I think all of us, why we're here and why we get so excited about the future of our region. So I first want to, before we do introductions and remind ourselves who's here, I want to welcome some new board members from, particularly from Kitsap County. So representing other cities and towns, Mayor Rob Punansu. Did I pronounce that? Patansu. Rob, Mayor. You're Mayor. Mayor Rob. I'll get it. We'll welcome. And then Councilmember Ron Peltier from City of Bainbridge Island. Welcome. We're glad to have you. Glad to have your participation. I understand, Councilmember Peltier, you're the alternate. The Mayor Rob is the member, but we're glad to have both of your participation here today. Thank you so much. On the phone, we have Commissioner Ed Wolf from Kitsap County. Commissioner, are you on the phone?
Correct. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Cynthia Pratt, Thurston Regional Planning Council. Cynthia, do we hear you there? Dr. Susan Turner from Kitsap Public Health District. Dr. Turner, are you there?
Good morning and thank you.
Thank you. And Mark McCaskill from Department of Commerce. Mark, are you with us yet?
I'm here.
Great, Mark. Thank you for making time. Is there anyone else on the phone that is not indicated? Well, great. So again, I'm Ryan Mello. I serve as your chair and also represent the city of Tacoma. And we'll go to my right to do introductions.
Good morning. I'm Hank Margerson. I serve as your vice chair. I represent the city of Redmond as a council member, but I'm also part of the Sound Cities Association.
Good morning. Edna Shin from Seattle Children's, representing business and labor.
You'll figure it out.
The other mayor will help you. The veteran mayor to your left.
No red. Pull a card out. Okay. Throw my name on the floor.
I'll get it for you.
Yours isn't Can you turn it the other way maybe? Because it's flashing weirdly. There you go. That should work.
This is really why we do introductions. Well, while we fix that, why don't we keep going on? Mayor Wheeler? We don't want to hear from Kitsap County today.
How about Bainbridge?
Yeah.
I resent that.
We love you all.
We like to think of Bainbridge as a county in itself. So I'm Ron Peltier, Bainbridge Island City Council. Good morning.
Jean Cole Wells, King County Council Member.
Terry Ryan, representing Snohomish County.
Jan Schwede, Arlington City Council, representing Snohomish County.
Jennifer Galatas, representing Alderwood Water and Wastewater District.
Lynn Robinson, Deputy Mayor, City of Bellevue, taking Mayor John Shelmanak's place today.
Scott Bader, Everett City Council.
Robin Mayhew, Washington State Department of Transportation.
Derek Young, Pierce County Council, also from the Kitsap Peninsula. So just to be clear, some of our mics are working.
Anthony Chen, Tacoma Pierce County Health Department.
John Holman, Auburn City Council, representing Sound Cities Association.
Pete Mayer, Metro Parks Tacoma.
Marty Koistra, Housing Development Consortium, Seattle, King County.
Patricia Akiyama, Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish County, representing business and labor.
Bryce Eden with FutureWise.
Paul Winterstein, Issaquah City Council, representing Sound Cities.
Jay Arnold, Deputy Mayor in Kirkland, representing Sound Cities.
Alan Eckberg, Mayor Tukwila, representing Sound Cities.
Thank you. And the mayors are working now.
Greg Wheeler, Mayor of Bremerton.
Rob Patansu, Port Orchard Mayor, representing other small cities. And with my abundance of vowels, Mayor Rob is just fine.
Thank you. Well, welcome again, everyone. Reminder that we've scheduled to 1 o'clock today. There's a chance we might conclude a little bit earlier, depending on how the conversations go. But we are scheduled till 1. At about 11:50, really close to then, we're going to break for a brief lunch break. So we do have lunch prepared. We're going to quickly get lunch and resettle to make the best use of your time and do a working lunch. So between 11:50 and noon, you can expect to get re-energized, and then we'll get right back to it. With that, we'll move on to public comment and look at the sign-in sheet. And anyone from the member of the public wishing to provide public comment, we'll have 2 minutes to do so. We have an on-screen timer to help you keep on time, and we'll discourage folks from using obscenities and personal attacks, so please be mindful of that as you're giving public comment today. The one and only person I have signed up is Alex Zimmerman. Mr. Zimmerman.
Heil, my dirty double-A Führer, a Nazi social democratic mafia with progressive Gestapo principle. My name is Alex Zimmerman. I'm president of Stand Up America. For many years, I told you, naturally born degenerate idiot, and bam, bada, boom. 80% people approve right now. Couple they have statistic. So 80% in Seattle, small nuance, not happy with what is your crook doing. 80% is a revolution. Massive revolution. This is exactly what has happened, because by definition, you not only, freaking idiot, you are criminal. You number one people enemy. What is you doing with us? It's not about only billion and billion dollars, $100 billion. What is you suck blood and money from us? It's about your mentality. You bring local county to pure fascism. Last week, annual report I'm present. This make me a shock. Everybody have same opinion. Everybody, yes, 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 yes. No one, no. From one mayor, from 4 county, from 4 million people, it's exactly who you are. And I told you many times, guys, I have experience with fascism before, but you more dangerous fascist, what is I know. And I spoke 1,000 times, you're more dangerous than Nazi or communist. Because it's America. We have a constitution, freedom of speech, life, liberty, and happiness. Pursuit of happiness. So I ask you again, start bring something different or go freaking away from this chamber. Stand up America, we stand up Washingtonia. We need to clean this dirty chamber from this government rat who make us last miserable for the last few years. Stand up Washingtonian. Thank you very much.
Anyone else wishing to provide comments to the policy board? Anyone else wishing to provide comment? Thanks, sir. We'll close public comment. We're going to move to item number 4, staff report. Paul?
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to June. It is hard to believe that we're already here, almost into the middle of the year, and summer fast approaching on us. I just wanted to make a couple announcements with some of the staffing and project changes we announced last month about how Michael Hubner is taking a spot at the City of Seattle. Tom Hager, the planning manager there at Seattle, who's been with the city for 30 years or over 30 years, is retiring this week. So Michael has stepped into his shoes, and we'll actually see him, fortunately, quite a bit here as he represents Seattle. And to fill Michael's spot, we've promoted Liz Underwood-Boltman to principal planner. Liz has been doing an amazing job for a number of years and is just an incredible talent here. So we think you'll be well cared for with Liz, both as a principal planner and taking a really key role on with the Vision 2050 project. We've also promoted Laura to a senior planner, and we'll be hiring a new senior planner to backfill in that area. And we have that job up on our web right now. So if you know of any good senior planners, encourage them to apply. Hopefully we'll be able to hire very quickly so that we have that staffing support to help on Vision as we go into the summer.
Thanks, Paul. Liz, what Paul really meant to say is you make him look really good. You do an excellent job.
That's obvious, right?
In all seriousness, Liz, you do amazing work. You support us really well and the region well. Congratulations. Excited to see that happen. Item number 5 is the consent agenda, which includes the minutes from our last meeting. Vice Chair Margison.
Move the consent agenda.
Is there a second? Properly moved and seconded. Councilmember Schweddy, any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion's adopted. Item number 6, coming back to the adoption of the scoping report for our Vision 2050 program. So the last time we met, we had discussion about the scoping report and some of the comments we had throughout the region. Staff considered those, made some edits to the draft report, and Paul's going to walk us through that. And it's my hope that we will be able to have a motion to adopt the scope and advance this project. So Paul, hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, we ran through the scoping report as well as a more detailed work plan at your last meeting. Some members talked about just wanting some more time to review it. Some asked some questions about how does it relate to Vision 2040, and also perhaps wanting some more detail about some of the steps over the course of the update. And I think a question about how the 1,300 plus comments that are recorded in there, what does it mean as far as how much we'll address that? So I'll just touch on how the report's been updated, a few edits made to it to respond to some of those comments and see if its current state is sufficient for you to guide the work as we go forward. This is our schedule graphic that we keep using just to acknowledge we were doing early work in 2017, doing some of the background data collection, preparing for the update with the adoption of the transportation plan last week, and with completing the scoping comment period over the early part of this year. And we're set to really start to dive into it. And in fact, really kind of have a great meeting plan today for you to have this first kind of big discussion about what's the growth strategy and what do we want out of it. So working on that type of topic and others throughout the course of this year, getting into the more formal process next year with SEPA review, public review of a draft plan, the board's review of those comments and additional changes to the draft plan, and then an adoption process in 2020. The scoping report is structured to be like the scoping report we did for Vision 2040 10 plus years ago. So we intentionally wanted to maintain that consistency. One of the changes, and if you have your packet in front of you on page 15 of the packet, page 5 of the report, is we added in more detail about when we say we're building off of Vision 2040, what's that mean? What is Vision 2040? So just giving any reader, whether they're a general member of the public or a board member or somebody from one of our stakeholders, a better understanding of what we mean by building off of 2040. What is 2040? What are some of the elements of what was it expecting for our growth strategy and for the regional plan? The scoping report also includes some assumptions about the update, the process, the summary of comments, expectations for the environmental review process under SEPA, that we're planning to prepare a supplement to the environmental impact statement, and that we plan to prepare both a no action alternative, essentially if we keep going with the plan as is, and prepare at least one alternative that looks at, well, what if we change that direction, in a variety of different ways. It also looks at a broad framework for how to update, topics to look at, and the schedule for updating the plan. We added, I want to jump ahead in that packet, some additional breakout on page 24 of just some of the fundamental changes, making it clear to people, kind of regardless of what we do with policies or new direction on the growth strategy, we need to extend to 2050. This is really fundamental both for supporting our future transportation plans, as well as to support your future comprehensive plan update. So we need that 2050 number. We have some statutory requirements, including a recent one by the legislature about school siting that we must respond to. We, of course, have outdated information. We have a number of regional plans like the open space plan, the transportation plan, and the economic strategy that have all been updated recently that may not require significant changes, but we want to recognize those more modern plans. And then there are board commitments such as implementing the regional centers framework that need to be brought into the update. So kind of at a baseline, we need to do those functional, fundamental types of changes. The regional growth strategy has been something you've, I think, talked about the most as being really important to tweak, adjust, redo, however you want to talk about it. And so it's been recognized as the primary aspect of the board's work here. We have 3 board work sessions planned for June, September, and November to really give you a lot of time to get down into the details. But so the scoping report's been adjusted on page 25 of the packet, where it really calls out the regional growth strategy as your fundamental item. And then there's additional clarity added beyond that, also on that same page, talking about some of the topics. Housing seems to be number 2, and so we've scheduled kind of the most staff effort on those 2 items, the growth strategy and housing, of developing data and information and board time to look at housing. We also recognized as several other policy areas of working off of climate change, resiliency, social equity, the integration of topics, implementation, community health, transportation, technology, annexation, environment and open space, and recognition of tribes as all other issues that there's important need to address during the Vision 2050 process. Some people asked in their comments about, well, are we going to address all 1,300 plus individual comments? And our suggestion is not to eliminate any of those comments. All of those comments may be useful and relevant as the board works through the process, whether it's on the growth strategy or any of these different policy areas. So rather than at the scoping time, try to filter those comments and say, yes, we're going to address these, and no, we're not going to address those, to really be able to hang on to all of those comments and make them important input throughout the process, recognizing that your focus is going to be kind of in this tiered way of looking first at the growth strategy and housing, and second at some of these other important policy issues. And some of the other ones that aren't listed here might still get done because maybe they're easy changes, or maybe they're information that affects other policy areas, but to not preclude that any of those other topics won't be addressed in some manner or be used in some manner during the process. So with that, we hope that the changes made respond to suggestions and questions that you had at your last meeting. And we would ask the board to consider taking a motion to adopt the scoping report.
Thank you for that briefing, Paul, and that good summary. We'll turn to discussion and comments from board members before we take a motion. Councilmember Schwedde?
Sorry, I was
trying to buy you time.
Oh, I was just going to make the motion.
Oh,
you
look at Miss Efficiency over
first?
here. We'll see if there's a couple of comments or questions. Ms. Akiyama.
Paul, I think we talked about this a little bit before the meeting, but as I understand it, the SEPA process includes bookends, kind of what can be studied under the scoping or under SEPA. So can you describe kind of what the bookends are?
The SEPA process, as described in the scoping reports, talks about a no action alternative. So that's required under SEPA. That would be if we kept Vision 2040 and continued in that same pattern. And then it indicates that we will look at one or more additional alternatives. So we have under the regional growth strategy work between now and November to decide what is that additional alternative or alternatives. So those alternatives could be bookends. It could be that over the next few months, you all decide like, hey, we found the golden ticket. This is the new alternative we all want to proceed with, and we could just focus on that one. Not suggesting that that's the way. Bookends is probably kind of the logical planning process to kind of pick like, well, what if we did one that's more this way and one that's more this way, to do that analysis and then to kind of see how do they perform, and maybe there's elements from each that you want to then combine back together after the CPIP process does that analysis. So bookends is kind of a typical way that we would do it, but rather than having the scoping report determine now exactly what those alternatives is, we have several months between now and November for the board to look at what are the types of scenarios you want to investigate, what are the alternatives you want to include in that CPIP process.
Councilmember Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of that bookend, Paul, and thank you, by the way, for our conversation yesterday. We just want to make sure that we're clear on what the expanse of those bookends are. And I think the way you answered it to me is that short of completely blowing up the growth strategy and deciding, my example, to put all the region's growth in like North Bend, which way your radical departure, that short of that, most of the alternatives that we could possibly come up with that maybe staff hasn't listed yet would still fit in those bookends. Is there a way to articulate that we can actually, in short, say, short of a radical departure, that it fits within this scoping? I'm just trying to think of a way we can articulate that more clearly, that there is still opportunity to present alternatives if they come up.
Right. It's articulated in the scoping report, perhaps in CPA-E's, if you will, as opposed to clearly as you suggest, which would be good. That as a supplement, it's building off of the old EIS, which looked at a wide range of alternatives. We looked at that time from if growth was all pushed out towards the edge, what would it be like? If growth was all concentrated, what would it be like? And then they created a hybrid and said like, okay, well, if we do kind of this, but kind of that and allowed for this, then what? So that EIS covers a wide range of ground. As Councilmember Young said, it did not look at, say, I'll use the example of, let's put all the growth in Stanwood or something extreme like that. So that would not fall within the old EIS. But I think any version of if we want to be more concentrated or slightly more distributed, within the urban growth area. And it's not to say that the urban growth area has to be permanently fixed as is, but it does not contemplate, say, blowing up the urban growth boundary and completely eliminating it. So I think in CPA-E's, I think the scoping report covers it, but we can continue to work both with you and the public at helping them understand what that means of staying within the bookends.
I think that's really helpful, at least for everyone at this table, is that, because it's based on that former, analysis, and just maybe finding a way to articulate that, right, maybe more to the public, but also to our colleagues, that would be helpful. But since you've said in CPA's that, short of a radical departure, I'm comfortable with where we're at.
Some suggested language to help us communicate that to our peers is a great suggestion. Councilmember Peltier.
Chairman. Thank you. Paul, I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about the what's going to be in the environmental review for 2050 regarding impacts to the natural environment, ecosystems from the growth that's projected. That would be helpful if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Right, and so it will cover, address impacts to the natural environment. It'll be at a regional scale, which is sometimes somewhat challenging, but we did have the original EIS and we'll update a number of aspects of that environmental analysis. So we actually have a chart coming up in the next presentation that will help explain this, but there are things like air quality, emissions, impacts to the climate, as well as we have information. We have some information about open space and open space preservation. A challenge, just to be upfront, a challenge with any alternative that we pick is that unless we pick a really extreme alternative, which we just said we'll try not to be that extreme, they probably won't show a lot of difference in, say, open space impacts, because if we're talking about growth within the urban growth area, then the open space outside of the urban growth area will be affected pretty similarly. So yes, it will address a number of aspects of the environment at a regional scale, but do be prepared that some of those aspects won't look that different from alternative to alternative.
Paul, will it include an evaluation of impacts to watersheds and water quality in Puget Sound and other sources of pollution that are impacting the sound?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Wolf, I think I hear you wanting to participate.
You hear me, and you'll be happy to know that I'll be very short because Councilman Young covered most of my points. We agree with Pierce County Chair and group that it's hard to clearly see what exactly the scope is of the review. But I have to say, after Paul's comments and response to Councilman Young, I'm much more comfortable with moving forward. So I'm not going to go through the points I wanted to raise, but I'll just say with regard to the environmental review and the scope, I think we're looking for this to be more transparent for the jurisdictions and the public as we move through the process on the scope of environmental review. So I'll close with that and just articulate more clearly in the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ms. Akiyama, then Councilmember Ryan.
I was just going to follow up on an earlier question about the environment. I was just wondering if you're looking at the impacts of the regional growth strategy out to 2050, the environmental impacts, wouldn't you also want to review what it will look like if actual growth patterns and current trends turn out to be different than what 2050 envisions and what we want to happen? So you take current trends into consideration, like let's say condos aren't being built now, but condos are a pretty big piece of getting urban density where we need it to be in big cities. If people don't meet their regional growth targets, then what happens to the growth that should be going to those places? And then you're coming across issues in some of these jurisdictions where you're getting a lot of residential concern and resistance and moratoriums coming on. Things like that are what a lot of our folks are seeing on the ground. So is there a way to also address those kinds of issues? So we're not just looking at the vision, what we want to see, but what might actually be happening? Thanks.
So the question on what alternatives to look at is a question for the board. That's something for us to talk about today in September and November, and for the board to say, okay, we want to look at a scenario that's more idealistic. We also want to look at a scenario that's more so-called realistic. That's certainly the direction that the board could give, and then that would define what goes into the SEPA analysis. But that's a question that we'll try to answer by November. I'll also say one of the questions for the board is if we go down that path of looking at, what's realistic? What are the trends? There's a big difference between trends from the last 3 years, the last 10 years, and the last 20 years. And we'll look at that a little bit today. And so if the last 3 years aren't on track, the last 20 years might be, and vice versa. Some of the things that were happening in the region 20 years ago has changed a lot. And so then it becomes a question for the board as to, none of us are perfect at anticipating which of those trends are most real, whether it's the most recent trends or the long-term trend. And we're looking out for the next 30 years, and of course we can't predict, who will be the next Amazon or if there will be a next Amazon. So it's really becomes a board question about how do we apply those trends to these alternatives? And that's a question to look at over the next several months.
So we'll go to Councilmember Ryan and then Councilmember Schweddy for a motion, likely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By the way, I missed the last couple of meetings because we were going to reassign this committee to someone else, and the council let me know it's going to be mine. So I'm happy to be back. Unfortunately, I did miss the last couple of meetings, so I'm a little bit not completely up to speed. Some of the other questions came up. I have similar questions, so those have been answered. I did want to point out just a couple of things here. And I, too, want to understand the parameters as it was discussed earlier, and happy to have some conversations with you, Paul, offline. I'll just give you an example. Like on packet page 15, it's a new paragraph here. It talks about an environmental review for Vision 2040 showed that compared with the broad range of alternatives, the desired growth pattern, et cetera. So That's a key phrase, because oftentimes our desired growth pattern doesn't reflect what's really happening on the ground. I can tell you in my district, we're running out of land quickly. And people can say, okay, well, there's urban growth areas up in Granite Falls or up in Arlington and whatnot. Well, the two largest builders in the fastest growing area in the county, which is North Creek, is the two largest builders told me, one of them said 50% of their buyers work at Amazon or Microsoft. The other builder told me it's 70% of their buyers work at Microsoft or Amazon. So they're commuting, and that either means they can't afford to live in Seattle or Bellevue or Redmond, or they want a bigger house or a new house or whatever. But it's really impacting us. So that's, and then we're running out of land, but we can't expand our urban growth area because there's more capacity elsewhere in the county. But do we, in Arlington, I'm not just saying this because Jan's sitting next to me, Arlington is a beautiful area. But if you're driving from Arlington to Microsoft every day, or Arlington to Amazon every day, that creates traffic problems on I-5, and it also affects quality of life because you're going to be sitting in your car for probably 2.5, 3 hours each way per day at times. So not trying to create more work for you, but I'm just curious, are we going to study what we want and also compare that to ideally what we want to what's actually happening on the ground?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And I think you'll see a lot of that today. Opportunity for us to both share with you some information, and we'll talk about this here in a minute. We'll share some information today. Hopefully we've kept it pretty concise for your benefit. We'll prepare a background report with more data because we love to give you data, but we also want to balance that with giving you all time to talk with each other about how do you deal with those situations. But that's why we have these three big board work sessions scheduled to talk about the growth strategy, is precisely what you're bringing up of, you know, how's it working? How's it not working? What do we want to, is this something we could adjust in the future, or is this something we need to adapt to?
Right, and then the last thing I'll say, and by the way, I'll support the motion, given all the conversation that's taking place. I would just caution the board, same thing that we went through on the regional centers. It's more important that we get it right than that we rush to a decision. And you know, that the growth centers took a long time, and you have the patience of Job. I mean, Ryan, you did a great job on that, and you did too, Hank, and Paul. But the thing is, we needed more time to get it right. I'm not saying we need more time in this right now until I dig into it and whatnot, but I don't want us to put a schedule on the board so we have to meet a certain date, and then we end up with a product that 3 years down the line we're like, we should have landed at a different place. So I just caution everybody, let's take our time, make sure we get it right.
I hate to, you know, put the board ever in a box. The board directs what we want to do. But for your benefit, Councilmember Ryan, as we've had some of this discussion about timing at a couple of the past meetings, and so I'll just reiterate some of our response, which is completing the plan adoption in 2020 is really important to be able to maintain the federal requirement of updating the transportation plan by 2022 and maintain federal funding for our communities.
No, I totally understand that. I've read that, and I'm very clear on that. I just, well then,
right.
There might be a way of...
We will do everything we can to kind of be flexible and create time and space and whatever to do what you want to do. But centers, we didn't have any deadline. We could kind of let the discussion go for as long as it wanted to go. Here, we do have a potential of impacting funding if we don't get done.
I understand. Well, we wouldn't want to impact that. I understand. I'm just trying to make a point that I don't want to see the board get rushed into a decision that we all regret later. Thank you.
Your point's well taken, Councilmember. Councilmember Gossett.
Oh, I forgot this. I'd like to say on behalf of King County that we have reviewed the scoping report, and we think that it is very consistent with the King County Growth Management Planning Council comments that we submitted earlier We are particularly happy that Vision 2040 is going to continue to be foundational in terms of building for what it is we'd like to see done in our four-county region by 2050, and that it's going to be a guidepost for what it is that we plan looking toward 2050 over the next couple of years. I, as one member of the King County Council, was particularly pleased when we decided to add meaningful incorporation of race, equity, and class issues in thinking about the future development of our respective beloved counties. And because of all of this, we look forward to working with everybody around the table toward having it all worked out by our General Assembly in 2020.
Thank you for those comments. Councilmember Schweddy?
Okay, I move to accept the scoping report for Vision 2050.
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Excuse me, Councilmember Cowells.
Thank you. I basically have more of a question to Paul. I had brought up at an earlier meeting a few months ago with regard to the survey that was being sent out and received in terms of the recommendations or the perceptions and ideas. And one of the questions, as I brought up earlier, had to do with why people move here. I don't see the specific question here now to refer to it directly, but there were forced choice answers. Is this ringing a bell? Yeah. And so a lot of it had to do with jobs and so forth. But I brought up then, and I still think it's an issue that we should address, that many people move here are attracted to the area because of jobs and the environment and all of that, but also because of the vibrant cultural and arts organizations here. And that was never included in any option. Now, I don't know that it fits into this, but I think it still is an important factor. And somewhere along the line, I would like that to be addressed and included.
It's an excellent reminder, and we haven't forgotten. So while we didn't list that as a strong policy area for discussion, I think that is a great example of one of those things that we can enhance in the plan. It probably doesn't require a policy debate so much, but something that I think the plan could do better. We actually received a great letter from the KRCC, the council from Kitsap County, that talked about wanting to emphasize people and cultural aspects, especially in the introductory element or introductory aspects of vision, which I thought was a great idea. And we've had some preliminary talks also with the tribes about how do we better recognize, the longstanding culture aspects of the tribes in the region. So I think there's a number of aspects there where we can enhance discussion of arts, culture, and people within vision document.
It's historical preservation.
Yes.
It's a very broad area, but I do believe that people are attracted to living in the area because of all of those elements. And in King County with for culture, and Councilmember Gossett and I unfortunately have to leave early. We have to go to a board meeting that's very critical. But we're trying very hard to address all of the region in King County to get the funding out for arts and cultural and historical preservation programming. And I think it's important. It just was never included in anywhere as an option for people. I would have liked to have seen more of an open-ended question that could have addressed that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cowells. And it's yet another reminder about why this place is so special and that we're not creating and developing any place USA. This place is incredibly special, and there's a number of key elements, as you articulated, that make it incredibly worth protecting and improving
so that it remains an amazing place for our kids and grandkids. So thank you for being so thoughtful about that. Councilmember Schweddy.
I thought I'd already made the motion.
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't want to speak to it anymore. We're ready to get on with it. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Aye.
Thank you. The motion's adopted. Good work, everybody. A lot of work ahead of us, which moves us right into item number 7, diving right into the regional growth strategy. We're going to have time to get into that data. Councilmember Ryan and all of us are very, very interested in the background, getting really clear about objectives about the growth strategy, and discuss all of our personal and collective interests in this body of work. So before we break up into groups and do small group discussions, we have a background briefing here led by Paul and the team, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. So, right, like I said, hope to balance here of giving you some of that trend data, background data, some background about Vision 2040, hopefully just enough to really stimulate the juices, and then ask you to spend some time talking with each other about some of the fundamental parts of the growth strategy and what we want to get out of it over the course of several months here. So I'm going to take you through just a kind of a quick review of the process that we have scheduled for working on this. We're not going to try to accomplish everything today. Ben's going to tell you a little bit about the background. He's one of the few people. Let's see, John Shulmanek's not here today. We often point to him as one of the few that was around the table 10 years ago. Ben was one of the others. I was in the back row somewhere. But we'll go through some of that background, talk a little bit more about performance. We reviewed some of that in March. We'll look at that a little bit further, then time for you to dive into it. We'll get back together, talk about the geographies. That's how we put cities in these different buckets. So we'll talk about some of the issues that have been raised over the last few years about the geographies and how we might adjust them and how we might then prepare over the course of the summer for some of the work that we'll be doing. So we thought the slide that really is our fundamental problem statement, right? We anticipate growing by about 1.8 million people and 1.2 million jobs across the region over the next 30 plus years. So when we talk about, why do we need a regional growth strategy, this is our fundamental reason. I mean, there are lots of other nuances to that we'll be getting into. How do we align growth with transportation? How do we have more equitable outcomes? How do we protect the environment? But this is kind of our fundamental objective. How do we accommodate the 5.8 million people that we anticipate coming? Are we wrong in that projection? Is it going to be 5.7? Is it going to be 5.9? We could be off, but essentially we need to prepare for this number and recognize that even if we're off by, say, 100,000, we're still in this ballpark 30 years out from now. So as I've talked about before, we have kind of this 3-part work plan before we get to picking an alternative and then more work after that occurs. Here we are today in June. We want to look at some of the background on the growth strategy, talk about how it's worked or hasn't worked, and talk about what are the objectives, both what were the objectives for the growth strategy and what do you think the objectives should be? Have those objectives changed? We'll spend some time over between now and September doing some additional analysis. We have a data team that's been crunching a lot of numbers, looking at, they're already taking the no action alternative, starting to plug that into some of the tools that we have. We'll bring to you in September some opportunity to discuss if we adjust the dials, if we put more growth in some places or more growth in other places, what might happen? What types of scenarios do we want to explore? With the idea that in November we can say, okay, well, let's pick this alternative and this alternative. We'll do the formal SEPA analysis on those so that then next year we can come back and say, okay, well, of those alternatives, we like this one best. Or maybe we like this part of this one, this part of that one, and we want to combine some things. And that works towards a draft plan of next summer. That's our general schedule. Councilmember Ryan's right. Best laid plans always get modified. We may make some adjustments. might have to add in an extra meeting or something like that to be able to accommodate whatever direction the board ends up going. But, trying to plan ahead as to a way we can have plenty of robust time to talk through these issues. So with that, we're going to dive into, or go back 10 years, and Ben's going to talk about some of the background.
Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, we felt that going back in time and remembering where we were and the conditions that we were really dealing with as we developed Vision 2040 and the growth strategy was a good starting point. And also recognizing that there are a lot of new council members, a lot of new faces around the table, just getting a really good grounding of what the growth strategy is and what it actually says. I mean, that may be different from growth patterns or growth trends that we've seen over the last several years, but this is the vision for how we would like the region to develop over time, and it was developed with some particular outcomes in mind. So I wanted to kind of remind you all of that. So prior to Vision 2040 was Vision 2020. So when I first started working here in 1999, Vision 2020 was the long-term vision for the region. And remember that that plan, that Vision 2020 plan, was developed in the early 1990s, right after the Growth Management Act was passed. And so it was primarily concerned with the region getting coordinated and getting around identifying a UGA, a fundamental sort of first step in the Growth Management Act of identifying and maintaining and using similar processes to simply identify the urban growth boundaries. That was a fundamental part of the Vision 2020 growth strategy, as well as simply emphasizing the need to develop compact communities associated with some blue sky, way in the future, high-capacity transit system that might be approved in the region. Remember, this was pre-Sound Transit, the RTA vote in 1996 that was successful. And then also, this was the first plan that formally designated centers. And those centers were identified at the county level and brought up to the regional level. So that was pretty much the extent of the regional growth strategy. Let's have a UGA, let's develop in a compact manner, and let's support centers throughout the region. Didn't say much more about that, and so as local jurisdictions worked at the county level and then in developing their first comprehensive plans in the mid-1990s, a lot of issues arose pretty quickly in terms of looking for some more regional guidance about where should centers be? How much growth should cities that have centers target compared to other cities that may not have designated centers? What about cities right on a boundary? Or what about cross-county issues or other interjurisdictional issues? So those were the challenges that were for discussion around the table as the Vision 2040 plan was developing. And this chart just illustrates, so the teal bars on the left sides are the targets that were developed, the first rounds of targets that were developed in the early to mid-1990s. And you can see that the curve generally of those teal bars was when you added up the growth targets that the counties independently, without much coordination, developed. When you added it up across the region, what we saw was more growth really focused on urban unincorporated areas, rural areas, small cities, larger cities. And the policymakers at the time said, is that what we really want for the long-term future for the region? And so that was a starting point. And you can see that it's a little premature, but the purple bars represent the relative shares of growth that are focused more to cities and places that have designated regional centers, those metro and core regional geographies, and then larger and smaller cities, all recognizing that those places are going to grow. And that there are real differences between the counties, that the relative shares of growth targeted, say, for urban unincorporated areas, that is a different relative share in Snohomish County than it is in King County, than it is in Kitsap County and Pierce County. But still, it was a move towards trying to encourage growth to locate in areas that are more urbanized and that will have the infrastructure to support that growth. So that's what was sort of the playing field that decision makers were working with when Vision 2040 was adopted. And so behind that regional growth strategy was a really clear recognition that this should be an aspirational plan, that we weren't necessarily seeing growth trends that we wanted over the long term. I'll show you in a moment that there were some, through the environmental analysis, there was a conclusion that pursuing or continuing on the existing trends at that time didn't yield the best outcomes, environmental or otherwise, for the region. And so it should be aspirational, but be based in reality. And so we looked at forecasts, we looked at growth trends, we looked at other factors, the environmental analysis, and the board concluded that the growth strategy, yes, it was aspirational. We were going to have to do some things differently, but it was achievable if we put our minds to it. It was also very clear, and it was the consensus of the board, and it's embodied in the growth strategy, that this is a multi-centered approach, that there are strong designated regional centers in every county, that those should offer access to opportunity and job opportunities for people from throughout the region. They should be connected not only to sort of the regional transportation system, but to their own transportation systems within each county, and that should move toward a better jobs housing balance across the entire region. And in fact, when looking at the control totals, to get technical, for the forecasts for each county, in the final numbers or percentages in the growth strategy, there was a policy choice to encourage more employment growth compared to the trend and compared to the forecasts at the time, more employment growth outside of King County and more housing growth in King County than we were seeing as the trend. That's the adopted policy, recognizing we wanted that better regional jobs housing balance. There was also, it's very important, I mentioned the differences by county, but the targets weren't developed for individual cities. They were not targets, but guidance for growth allocations were developed for groups or classes or types of places, recognizing that small cities within Snohomish County are very different from one another. Some will grow much more quickly and have a capacity to accommodate growth much more so than others, and that the counties and local jurisdictions working in their county processes should make that call. That the regional growth strategy was guidance for that, but that there would be differences around the region in the way that the counties worked with their cities. So that's the background of what's really at the guts and the heart of the regional growth strategy. Paul mentioned this earlier. The four initial alternatives that were evaluated in the draft environmental impact statement were growth targets extended. So that was, looking back at that chart, it was quite a lot of growth in urban unincorporated areas, a fair amount in rural areas. And so that pattern was looked at in the EIS. There was an alternative that concentrated more growth in the metropolitan cities of Seattle, Bellevue, Everett, Bremerton, and Tacoma. There was an alternative that looked at more growth in sort of those, you can call them the first ring cities, cities like Shoreline and Redmond and Kirkland and Renton and so forth. That band of cities would have relatively more growth. And then there was an alternative that looked at most of the growth happening in urban unincorporated areas and in small cities. And through the analysis, a hybrid alternative was developed that really drew from all of those alternatives at some level. And just this is difficult to read, and it's actually truncated from the full version, but in the analysis, we looked at things like environmental quality. There's some specific measures there, economic prosperity, land use, transportation, environmental justice. Public health is not listed on this chart, and also efficiency to serve growth with public services and existing infrastructure. And you can see that the alternatives were evaluated, and there were some compromises made in terms of identifying an alternative that maybe didn't do best in each of those things, but did collectively across the measures performed best when evaluated against one another. So that's the CEPA process that we're going to be building on. Will carry forward this analysis as well. So overall, the objectives for the growth strategy were and are protecting the natural environment and natural resource lands, focusing growth in urban growth areas within cities and within centers, keeping rural areas rural, making sure that they're healthy and that they're viable over the long term, improving that balance of jobs and housing across the region, and achieving a growth pattern that's efficient to serve with infrastructure. It was recognized then, and I think it may be even true even more so today, that local jurisdictions and agencies are having some real challenges in providing the infrastructure to support and accommodate growth, and that the pattern of growth that the region develops in over time should be as efficient as possible to serve, and should be possible to serve. And then, of course, there are environmental benefits as well that were paramount in developing the regional growth strategy. Also important to recognize that the policies, the multi-county planning policies that are in the Vision 2040 plan, were seen as ways to either help implement the regional growth strategy or potentially to mitigate some of its effects or impacts. And so there's that relationship that the pattern is both a tool, it gets fairly abstract, but the pattern is a tool to help achieve these objectives, environmental, economic, social, and otherwise. And also that the pattern is something that will help to drive economic development and to help to preserve the quality of life in this region over the long term. So that's trying to wrap up a lot of concepts that are in the Vision 2040 plan, and hopefully that serves as some good background that we can build on today in your conversations about what the objectives of the growth strategy should be moving forward. I can turn it over to Paul.
So thanks, Ben. I mean, as I mentioned, one of the great things about working here is, a planning geek, is that we have this data team that comes up with tons and tons of data. So I have my little packet here. We're going to work on developing a background report that we can give you sometime this summer or fall as you get into these discussions. And in March, we gave you really just a kind of a numeric, a bunch of bar graphs of, are we hitting the growth strategy from a numeric standpoint. Today, we wanted to touch on those a little bit, but also touch on these objectives. So are we meeting the objectives? And as I said, there's a lot more data, so we could just swamp you with this, and you can stop me short any time. But we wanted to give you a little bit. It's really important to talk about this timing. So when we look at the data, we go back to the year 2000, partly because when we did the analysis on Vision 2040, we started with the year 2000. So we looked at 2000 forward. So you'll see a lot of our comparisons to that time period. But of course, Vision wasn't adopted till 2008. Most of your local plans weren't adopted till about 2015, implementing Vision 2040. And so it's a bit of a judgment call as to how much of Vision 2040 has actually been implemented. A number of things have happened. Some of the things are lining up better with Vision, but we're really still just at the beginning stages of implementing Vision 2040. So when we look at this data, we're looking back to a time period before Vision was even adopted and considering a span of period where we were still doing a lot of local work at implementing Vision. So take all that with a big grain of salt, and that goes back to my comment about, which trends are kind of the most important to look at. Overall, and here we have the outlined bars is what the growth strategy is adopted in Vision, and the colored bars are what's happened over the last 17 years. And as Michael presented this back a few months ago, those bars aren't too far off. So at a broad regional scale, the growth in the region is lining up more or less with the regional growth strategy. So we're not far off from alignment. You can see higher than anticipated for the urban unincorporated area, although a lot of that growth occurred in the prior decade. Some of that's still occurring, but a lot of that occurred in the prior decade, as was shown earlier. And when we look at it county by county, again, some of the population growth in King County is higher than anticipated. I'll talk about this in a minute, but we actually anticipated that population growth in King County would be on a downward slope, and so it's been surprising to us that it's been back on an upward slope. And employment, I'll get into this a little bit more too, but a lot of people are looking at the last few years with Amazon and King County's job growth and thinking, why are all the jobs going to Seattle? In the last 17 years, King County's been a little bit still underperforming on job growth. Pierce County's pretty much right on. Snohomish County's a little bit ahead. Now, if you look at just the last few years, that's flipped because of the Amazon growth. But over the last 17 years, that what we were we, meaning the board, PSRC, was really trying to say, how do we get more population growth within our urban centers and within King County to switch some of this jobs housing balance? And we actually worked in that direction. We didn't make big gains, but I have here just from jobs, and it kind of shows up here, maybe not too well, but percent share of jobs, King County went from 68 to 66%. And Pierce County went up 1%, and Snohomish County went up 1%. So we did get a little bit better in that jobs housing balance across the region. One of our objectives was to prevent sprawl and to keep our rural and working lands preserved. We're doing relatively well on that. 96%, you've seen this slide before, of permitted housing now going into the urban area. So we've improved on that from what we did. We said, hey, we want more growth going into cities and centers. Josh has a series of these slides talking about how Seattle has changed. Kind of the snapshot that I like to put on it is in the 1960 to 1990 period, remember, Seattle lost population. In the last 7 years, the city of Seattle proper has grown by the city of Everett. So we've really, and I don't think we anticipated that with Vision 2040. Even though it was starting to occur already then, growth was coming back to Seattle, but it was at a pretty modest rate. And now the population growth, not just the job growth, but the population growth in King County and in Seattle has really been phenomenal. We also, we said, hey, this was going to happen, that our centers around the region would grow and become these vibrant urban places. And a lot of us looked at us with rolled eyes, of is downtown Linwood going to become a regional growth center? Really? Now it has 2 high-rise buildings under construction and a bunch of housing under construction. Tukwila has a high-rise building that's just finished. I think it's like 18 stories or something like that. This is called Washington Place. We see many of the communities that either have regional growth centers or light rail stations or sounder stations or other forms of transit planning for growth around the region. We're trying to create a comprehensive list, but I think every light rail station from here to Everett has some form of planning that's already occurred or is occurring. To the south, pretty much the same thing. Most of the sounder stations all have some sort of plan around them. So lots of planning activity. I think 10 years ago, the question was, if you plan it, will they come? And that might still be a question in some communities, but like the examples of Tukwila and Linwood, we're certainly seeing that development actually take place on the ground. Wanted to touch base, there's tons of data, like I said, want to touch base a little bit on the metro cities, because like I said, here, we were going in a different direction 10 years ago. The gray bar is where we were in 2000 for base, for the share. The population for King County metro cities, this is share of the county's population, was just above 50%. The 2000 to 2008 share was getting close to half that. So we were, if we're Seattle and Bellevue, they're the King County metro cities, that population growth was much lower than it had been historically. So when we wrote the regional growth strategy, that middle outlined bar, we said, hey, we want to put more growth back into our big cities. Thought we were being aspirational. And then the 2 purple bars to the right show you how we've actually exceeded that population growth since 2008. So if we look back since 2000, that kind of evens out, and we're kind of just about on track. But in recent years, we're actually exceeding that. And the thing was, we thought we were on a downward trend, and then somewhere in there, things shifted, and now we're on an upward trend for population going into Seattle and Bellevue. A lot of people look at Everett and Tacoma and say, when are they going to catch on? And why don't we get more growth happening in those cities? That might be happening. It might be too soon to tell. Bremerton, Tacoma, and Everett, I think all really struggled in the time period of 2008 to 2010 and even going through the recession. really slow anemic growth. I mean, I think Bremerton's there at like 3.5% during that prior decade. You see Bremerton now in the last 3 years exceeding the rate of growth called for in the regional growth strategy. So we kind of get stuck into what were cities like, say, over the last decade. I mean, I still get stuck in thinking of Tacoma or Bremerton as to how they've been performing over the last 20 years. But the data from the last few years is showing that those cities really have been changing. Are they going to catch up to the level that we were hoping for in the regional growth strategy? Is Tacoma going to get up to that 32%? Or do we want it to? Those are good questions for the board to think about and to speculate. But certainly the recent trends do show a lot of improvement with our metro cities. So overall, like I said, tons of data that we could look at even further. Long range, big picture. A lot of the data does at a regional scale line up reasonably well with the regional growth strategy, recognizing that we're still at the early stages of implementing it. There's a lot more work for cities to do. And a lot of this plays out over the long term. I use my experience from Bellevue, where the city council said, we want to plan for Bellred. They said that in 2003. They started the planning work in 2006. They adopted the plan in 2009, and now we're seeing the development. That's a 15-year period from recognizing we want to do something to seeing the development occur. So if we've only been implementing vision for the last few years, we really have a long period for those plans to take place. But we are seeing more growth in urban areas, within cities, and in centers. We are seeing cities plan successfully for those places. We're seeing less growth in the rural and resource areas. We see metro cities catching up, but still big question marks about, are they going to maintain that trend into the future? And what more do we need to support that? We still see unincorporated urban areas continuing to grow faster than what we planned for in the regional growth strategy. So a question there is to how do we account for that, or what do we do to adjust for that? Jobs housing balance has been a big discussion here with this board. We've seen some improvement, actually. It's hard to kind of feel like that there's an improvement out there on the streets or in our neighborhoods. From a data standpoint, we've seen some modest improvement. Still a huge challenge overall. And then this last question, which is a question we can ponder throughout the update, is how much are the past few years indicative of our future trends? How much, or do we look at the past 3 years, 7 years, 20 years? How do we use that data to anticipate how the trends will be in the future? So we just want to recap. These are the objectives to talk about today. Protecting the environment and the resource lands, preventing sprawl, focusing growth within the urban area, improving jobs housing balance, having a growth pattern that's efficient to serve, minimizing emissions and other impacts to the environment. So those are the objectives that were laid out with Vision 2040, and our questions for you today, are those the same objectives? Or should we be shifting? Some of the scoping comments that we received relate partly to that, part of what we'll talk about at future meetings, about regional geographies, about the role of the unincorporated urban areas, the balance of achievable and trends versus aspiration, the need for accountability, consequences, or incentives. How do we make this real? And as well as how do we balance guidance versus flexibility, guidance and flexibility without accountability? So those are some of the scoping comments for you to consider as you have this discussion. And then we took a preview of this discussion to the Regional Staff Committee, and things that they thought were maybe missing from those original set of objectives is recognizing not just jobs housing balance at a gross scale, but that there are different types of jobs and housing. Having a balance within a city, but when your housing supply is all high-end housing and your jobs are all low-paying jobs, that you might have a numeric balance, but you still have people commuting out and commuting in. So how do we look at those different types and get that better balance across our jurisdictions? Better recognizing how we leverage our infrastructure investments, transit and otherwise. How do we better support public health with the growth strategy? And how do we address social equity? So things that weren't as strongly, at least as strongly discussed in the regional objectives that might be important factors to consider this time around. So with that, I might look to Liz to help guide us, but we have these two broad questions for you. Do the original objectives still work? Are there other things we want to consider, like the things that were suggested by the regional staff committee? We're going to break you up into two groups so that you can have a more detailed discussion. We have this room and we have the room next door. We didn't give you candy or Post-it notes or anything, so we're going to ask you essentially just to split. I was going to say, this half might go over there and this half might stay. You could do that, recognizing that I think a lot of SEA members are over here. We kind of have a Kitsap contingent over here. If you want to hang out together, great. If you want to split apart to get both rooms, great. There are, let's see, 3, 9, 10. You want 10 or so on each side. So if you see yourselves imbalanced, you might just self-adjust so that you have good balance in the rooms.
That's it. I would just add that so there's a single sheet that summarizes the objectives that we've reviewed a couple times with you at the top, as well as the questions or the topics that the regional staff committee identified, and then the questions that we'll go over. So if the half that stays in this room can gather on this side of the room, then Liz and I will take that over and walk you through that.
And Jeff and I will be going to the room next door. So those of you that are going to go next door, Jeff and I will be recording, facilitating over there.
And we encourage some mixing.
So just so that we're clear, we're gonna move into both rooms. We're gonna encourage folks to self-select themselves. The facilitators are gonna help us break at about 11:45 to get some food, finish, and we'll come back here and there'll be a wrap-up discussion and also wrap-up slides. So there's definitely more discussion to have and final briefing to have in the large group after the small groups.
Right, so we might just shift by about 5 minutes to allow for us having just gone over a little bit. So we'll try to break out about 10 till.
Great.
Give you a half an hour for discussion, but as Chair Mello said, we have some additional slides and we want some whole group discussion afterwards. So we'll break for lunch, come back into this room.
Okay, let's do that. Thank you. I know folks haven't really just got their meals, but in order to make good use of time, we'll respectfully ask that we do a working lunch here. We're going to spend the next about 40 minutes or so, both reporting back out on how those small group discussions went, reflecting on them, and also reflecting on the information we got in the slide deck before to prepare for these conversations. And remind you, we do have some summary slides to take us into next steps after our reflections. So Paul, I'm going to punt it back to you to help facilitate this conversation here.
Yeah, great. Thank you. This we heard had a great discussion. I'm going to ask Jeff and Hank to help me out here as far as summarizing. One of the things we started to talk about were the geographies. So we do have a few slides about the geographies that we'll get to in a few minutes, and then have more time for you to be able to talk about what you heard amongst your different groups, as well as some of these thoughts about the geographies, the way that we define groups. So I'm going to start, and then Jeff took notes, so I'll probably forget a couple things. As we've had in several of our past meetings, a lot of discussion about the nuances of what it means for jobs housing balance. Job income, type of housing, diversity of housing, affordability of housing, and how those things line up. a fair amount of discussion about how is growth also aligned with infrastructure, especially transit and ferries, and we'll talk about that a little bit with the geographies. And then also a discussion about industrial, and in some ways this connects to that question of jobs, but industrial uses, freight corridors, freight mobility, recognizing that those jobs, having those jobs available is part of that jobs equation, but that we also need to protect the opportunity for that to remain and grow in the future. So Jeff, how'd I do, and what did I miss?
So that was good. Let me, I just pulled together a quick summary of what I heard today. So I think in general there was support that the objectives were good. However, it was noted that they are very high level. Perhaps they could be more specific. I think we also heard definitely a theme, as Paul mentioned, on housing. So that addressed a number of topics related to housing, including affordability, trying to match the housing needs with incomes, as well as even a conversation about having some housing minimums. We also heard there might be some specifics missing in the objectives. That was similar to what Paul mentioned, industrial uses, the protection of industrial uses, ensuring freight access to those industrial uses. We also heard about quality of life should somehow be included in the objectives. And then finally, I think another one of the takeaways was that in all the conversations, there was really discussion of measurements, some metrics. So perhaps an objective that the regional growth strategy is measurable and that there are ways to measure it and evaluate its success.
I'll add my part. So they've done a fantastic job, and Jeff took better notes than I did. But I did note we also talked. It goes back to the housing, and it probably more along the lines of the balance and whatnot. But it was mentioned about an equitable pattern of development. It was mentioned early on. We also talked about how growth is focused, whether it's focused in cities exclusively, and then how UGAs are not all exactly the same. And, development within a UGA might be okay if there's enough services to support it. So those are some of the concepts. So we actually had a pretty wide-ranging conversation in our group.
Well, I'll begin for the group that stayed in here. Many of the same themes were discussed. Also noting there was support for the current objectives that we reviewed, but that they all seem to need qualitative terms or better descriptors to describe exactly what we want out of those things. So, access to the natural environment or access to housing, to different types of housing and so forth. So that we could work better to do that. It was noted that a more centrally and essentially located and obvious overall vision statement would be helpful for the plan. And then other topics were also supported: resiliency, response to innovation and change, adaptability and flexibility, a lot of support for leveraging existing and future infrastructure investments, and really taking advantage of where we know that supportive infrastructure is going to be. Had a very similar conversation about that jobs housing balance needing to be much more nuanced to reflect rents and house prices and income levels and types of jobs, and understanding where people are traveling and where they're living. And again, also a strong interest in metrics and evaluation and accountability. So how do we build into the plan, or at least have a conversation about what are our expectations for accountability and or for local flexibility, and those may be in conflict at some times, and so we should have a clear and good conversation about that. Liz, did I miss anything? I think that covers it. About Chair Mello?
We started, that's an excellent summary. One thing that stood out to me in addition to the good summary was there was a conversation that just began to start in our group about communities playing off of each other, and what if one community or a couple of communities have robust affordable housing policies, let's say, and others don't. what then happens, and how then are there maybe winners and losers because a couple of communities took it upon themselves to put in some, let's say, robust affordable housing policy. So that's an example. I think it's a really interesting discussion about how the region works and the market works in this with all these, whatever it is, however how many cities there are, lots and lots of cities in this 4-county region.
82, just for a reference. That's a great summary. We want to encourage you to have a discussion, but we do want to hit on a few slides about the regional geographies, which tie directly into a number of those points. One thing that Councilmember Margison pointed out, I think it's the same one that we were on. Sorry, Ben. That I thought was a great illustration of the challenge, which is we talked about better aligning jobs and housing and incomes and housing affordability, and then he pointed out, well, what if you have a community that has mostly high-paying jobs? Does that mean your community should only plan for expensive housing? He didn't quite say it that way, but that's me paraphrasing and twisting it a little bit. But I thought it was a really great illustration how we do want communities planning for the types of housing needed for their community, but perhaps getting to that, what Charmelo was talking about, that kind of the externalities of the broader community around them, the cities around them, we can't kind of expect, hey, your neighboring city is going to take all the affordability because we have planned for all the high income or something of that. That there is that challenge that it's not just pairing up housing to jobs, but really there's another depth to it beyond that as well. So we do want time for you to reflect and comment, but before we get to that, we want to do a few slides on the geography, so I'm going to turn it over to Liz.
Thank you. So yeah, we're going to get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the regional growth strategy and talk about regional geographies. So as a kind of point of context, there are basically kind of two big parts of the growth strategy. One is how we group cities together, which is what we call regional geographies, and group cities and other types of places in the region. And then the other sort of side of it is how much growth is allocated to those types of places. So as part of our work here, we've gotten a number of comments during the scoping period about the regional geographies. These are comments that may sort of trigger memories of previous board conversations, because the board has actually talked about this a little bit in the past. Comments in particular about the distinction between small cities and larger cities, and sort of what types of places are we supporting in the region. So the geographies right now sort of split the kind of groups of cities into different types of places, and I'll kind of walk through that. The overall intent here is for the region to maintain different types of places. So we hear all the time that not every community is Seattle, and this basically reflects that in a nutshell, that we know there are different types of places, smaller cities, larger communities, rural areas that we all kind of want to maintain into the future, and so to try to allocate growth to those places appropriately. So I guess the question for us to be thinking about is what are the kind of right characteristics to be thinking about as we sort of group different types of places.
Went out. Very last page of the packet has the map.
Yes, the last page of the packet has the map of where these places actually are in the region. But I'll kind of walk through the different types of places. So we have metropolitan cities. These are the largest cities in each county. So Seattle, Bellevue, Everett, Tacoma, and Bremerton. We have core cities, which are the remaining cities that have regional growth centers, cities like Redmond, Puyallup, Bothell. So these are places that we talked a lot about during the Regional Centers Framework Update, so they have a regional center. Larger cities are cities that have a combined jobs and population of more than 22,500. So we have about 21 of these cities in the region, and so they're kind of some of the larger sort of suburban places, but they don't necessarily have a regional growth center. We also have small cities. So those are cities with a combined population of 22,500 or less. So many of these are actually very small communities and are kind of not near that particular threshold. About half of the cities in the region are classified as small cities and include places like South Prairie and Ruston and the Point cities and Stanwood, which was mentioned earlier. So some of our smallest communities in the region. Unincorporated urban areas are unincorporated areas within the urban growth area. And these places vary significantly between places that have seen a fair bit of growth and have sort of access to transit or other types of transportation infrastructure, or places that are sort of farther away from job centers or are less developed overall. Rural areas, these are areas located outside of the urban growth area, and pictured here is Vashon Island, and resource lands, which include designated agricultural, forest, and mineral lands. So different types of places, and the idea is to allocate different types of shares to different types of places. So one of the comments that we got most extensively during the scoping period about the geographies was this distinction between small and larger cities, whether that is a meaningful distinction and whether it really identifies places that are different. We also heard comments about the role of unincorporated urban areas in particular, that there are different types of unincorporated areas, that maybe there should be additional nuance in the geographies. So those are some of the kind of most pointed comments that we got on the geographies. Also, an interest from the board as expressed through the Center's framework update in identifying military installations, which was also reflected in some of the comments. So as part of this work, we're kind of trying to think of some preliminary concepts of how we might update the geographies to reflect some of the comments that we have heard and the overall objectives of the regional growth strategy. So some of the preliminary concepts are reaffirming the focus on jurisdictions with designated regional centers. This was obviously a big part of the board's work over the last year. But looking, kind of keying in on that difference between small and larger cities, so looking more closely at cities where they have existing or planned high-capacity transit. That includes places like items like light rail, bus rapid transit, commuter rail, ferry, as ways to sort of distinguish between city types. So amongst those types of places, whether they have access to high-capacity transit or not. Identifying unincorporated areas with high-quality transit service as well as and potentially pulling those out as different types of unincorporated areas, and recognizing major military installations. So we're interested in some feedback from the board as we sort of start to develop concepts for updating the growth strategy, of whether some of these things make sense to you, whether you have other types of feedback. This is just one of the sort of initial stages of being able to make updates or possibly propose alternatives around the growth strategy.
Councilmember Young, save you from the...
Get out of my head, Mello. So I brought this up in our small group, but one thing I think that we should discuss more is that these regional geographies were probably a first beta concept for how we develop as a region, but they probably aren't enough to distinguish. We have small cities that operate very differently than each other, or that their definitions aren't large enough to serve where they are in terms of the region's development. The same goes for some of our core cities. But I think one of the biggest gaps that we see as a county is the unincorporated UGA, which has a diversity of communities within them, from basically what operates as a very small city to what operates really as a more core city. So for example, Frederickson, which is a manufacturing industrial center, is in our unincorporated UGA, and so we tend to want to discourage growth to that area but if you look at its size, its population, and the importance of to the local economy, it's more like one of our core cities. It's just unincorporated. So it seems I think to me and to some of us, that if we can spend some time trying to make that definition more useful in particular, because, for example, the Parkland, we want to, correct, bad planning from years past and create a community that can then incorporate, and that means growth in parts of it. In other parts of the unincorporated UGA, we should not be steering growth, at least beyond the 4 units an acre or whatever kind of we deem as a minimum. And by the way, we should probably talk about a housing minimum at some point, because we've seen some communities start to push back against that, and that'll have some follow-on effects. But it feels to me like narrowing down some of the unincorporated UGA, growth in it isn't all bad. In fact, in some cases, it will repair bad planning from years and years ago.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler.
All right, so Ryan, I wanted to follow up, Chair Mello, I wanted to follow up on a couple of your comments. You know, all these preliminary concepts are fine, but they're just it's almost like we're just counting bodies. And what we should be doing is recognizing that we need different incomes levels in transit centers or in urban centers or near jobs for a number of reasons. One, if you create, let's just say for transit center, if you transit-oriented development, fantastic. There's nothing in there controlling the escalation of pricing. They're attractive. Right now the prices go up on those. You force lower incomes out, the ones that actually do a lot of work in your cities, in our city. You create congestion in another way. It's displacement. And so for myself to see this, it's fine, but you know, it actually has to be, you know, and I think our board's going to take this approach. We have to be more critical when we look at this in the future. We've seen what happens. To me, piling folks together and thinking we're controlling growth properly or responsibly is not correct. It's not the answer. It has to be more comprehensive than that.
Thank you. Vice Chair Margison.
Thank you. So this kind of goes back to the previous slide where we talked about objectives, but I promise I'll try to tie it together with regional geographies too. So an observation I made as we were going through this exercise a bit ago was, if you look at the objectives that 2040 incorporated for regional growth strategy, they're very environmentally focused if you look at them. I mean, there's a lot of them that are environmentally focused. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what they're focused on. And so, but it's a regional growth strategy that is very environmentally focused, which means we're essentially trying to keep growth out of sort of areas that we didn't want growth, right? And I think if you go back and measure it, we probably could say we have achieved it, and that came out in our conversation. The flip side is, where do we want growth? And that's what's missing from the objectives, really. I mean, there's a little bit in there about a better balance, and there's a little bit in there about infrastructure and new investment should be more efficient and all that. But we're really not focused, you know, we really ought to be more, I guess, deliberate about. And I think this regional geographies conversation, I promised I'd bring it back to this, speaks to that. And so instead of saying we're going to have city A, B, C, D, and E, and they're going to cascade the growth in those areas, cities that are categorized in cities, let's say category D, may not all be the same. Some may be low growth. Others may be small or smaller, but they may have the capacity, if you will, whether because they have infrastructure or they're on a light rail line or they have a freeway that goes right through the middle of them, to grow and succeed in a different way. And so a one-size-fits-all approach may not necessarily be the way to go forward with how we do this. And I think around the table, I think there's a general agreement that as we go forward, we have to be cognizant that having a one-size-fits-all approach may not necessarily be the way to go, but to have a little bit more variety. And it again speaks to the UUGA area, or the UGA area, where I guess it's the UUGA areas, where Councilmember Young said they're not all equal. Some actually operate like small cities, or cities, essentially. They have the infrastructure, and I use infrastructure very broadly there, to support the growth that has occurred. And that's probably okay. There may be reasons why they're not incorporated that I can't answer to. And there are other aspects of that. Some smaller cities may have opportunities that arise that would encourage some growth there that we may not have anticipated. And by saying you're a small city, therefore you get 8% of the growth, or whatever the case may be, that sort of pigeonholes somebody into a place, but they have the capacity to grow larger because, again, they're on at the end of a ferry, or they have a train that goes through there, or they're on a freeway or something like that. And the way they're growing is reversing a commute, or they're doing some such thing. So logic and sense, and I wrote on here, we need to address reality. And I didn't bring it up during the meeting, but we do need to address reality. I mean, because we can plan all we want, but there has to be a reality check in this process too. So I'll just stop there and throw that out there and say, I like where the preliminary concepts are going, but I don't like, I'll say this, that we're only looking at high capacity transit as the sort of the modifier, if you will, because there may be other infrastructure out there that might support ways to differentiate cities. And I'm not even going to use the word smaller and larger. I'm just going to say cities, because I want to get away from smaller and larger.
Thanks. Board Member Akiyama.
I wanted to follow up on that. I agree with what you were talking about, and I guess I also had a question that I talked a little bit about in our breakout group on the idea of flexibility, because we talk about regional growth strategy, providing flexibility to counties and cities to identify appropriate growth targets. And it just kind of makes me think maybe we should talk a little bit about what the definition of flexibility is. Does that mean we're going to let people do whatever they feel like they want to do, depending on what that jurisdiction thinks? Or do we want to hold them accountable and make it kind of a prescriptive thing where we're saying this is your number and you have to meet it? And it just seems like it would be important to have that kind of discussion and really dig into what we want, and to Councilmember Margison's point, where we want to see growth, where it makes sense, where the transit investments are, but also really talk about how can we make that happen, and whether we want to stick with a word like flexibility unless we really know what that means.
So just to clarify, kind of in the context of, I think, what the phrase that you're talking about, the flexibility, the way that this is working is that we're grouping a larger bunch of cities together, and that some of the more detail of, where there's capacity, where there's local interest and investments, and those sorts of things are sort of all factored in at the local level as they develop targets for their local planning process. So when we, for example, for this, metropolitan cities in King County, there are 2 metropolitan cities, but there's sort of one number within the plan. And so it was a question of Seattle and Bellevue sort of dividing up the allocation between them. So I think that's the question of flexibility, of sort of it's assigning a larger number to places that are very different, to have a sort of discussion at the local level during the target setting process. But I think you're also talking about how we implement the plan, and that's certainly something that we do need to continue to talk about.
I want to put a premise out on the table, and you can reject it if you don't like it, but where the board has been in the past with that kind of flexibility aspect in geographies versus individual cities. So, and Ben, you can chime in as far as how I characterize the board's decision 10 years ago, but it was the idea that PSRC should not be setting targets for individual cities, and that there should be a target setting process, as Liz was describing, at that countywide level where the cities all get together and hammer that stuff out. But at the same time, as you said, there are some challenges, and so providing a flexible framework where the vision does 2 things. One, it sets a time period beyond the target time period, so they don't precisely match, and that's intentional, so that targets can work towards the growth strategy numbers, but don't have to, aim directly in that alignment. And then, for the most part, that there are a number of cities within each category, so it allows for a little bit of horse trading between cities, and a Medina that doesn't want a lot of growth can trade or negotiate with a small city like Duval that maybe wants a little bit more, and there can be that adjustment occur at the countywide level. So the premise is PSRC, the plan should not be defining individual city targets that are precisely aligned with GMA, but we should maintain this longer time period, broader categories, so that more nuanced discussion can continue to occur at the countywide level.
Yeah, I think that's precisely right. The one thing I'd add is in the EIS process, when we had the 4 alternatives I described earlier, metropolitan cities, growth targets extended, larger cities and smaller cities, there were specific numbers for every city associated with those different alternatives, and we heard very clearly pull back from that approach, that the hybrid preferred alternative should provide a flexibility for the countywide process, which is the place that GMA talks about where targets are set. Targets aren't set here. Guidance for relative roles of cities in target setting is appropriate for regional plan, but that the county and its cities is the place where targets should be set. So that's definitely was the aim for that flexibility.
Mayor Wheeler.
All right, so thank you. And I spoke once on this, but again, on page 15 of our the draft version of the scoping document, we talk about housing, climate change, social equity, and you've given this at least you've given it enough weight to put in the document. But to me, unless we're looking at this through a lens, the housing affordability, the climate change and resiliency, and the social equity lens, then we won't meet what at least from my perspective, what is most important about planning. And so I don't, as we move forward, I think these need considerable weight, and they actually have to be a lens. And because affordable housing, that's going to change everything, and that leads into social equity, which ties into the environment. Those are just some comments going forward.
If I could offer one response, some of these things that you're bringing up are sound like direction for policies, for multi-county planning policy adjustments. So we can talk about relative distribution of growth around the region as a pattern, but then the policies can be much more specific about how we want that housing development to look, or what are some of the characteristics of growth that ought to be part of the way we implement an overall development pattern. So there are two parts to the vision update, looking at the policy language and also looking at just the general distribution of growth, which we can analyze more empirically.
So so you said the county, this should be addressed at the countywide planning policies? Or
no, so in vision, there's the multi-county plan. There are two pieces: the multi-county planning policies, which can be much more descriptive about intent, and then there's something that is fairly numeric in terms that we can analyze through our models and through an environmental impact statement process to look at potential impacts on the environment and on communities of a growth pattern. So those two pieces work hand in hand.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Mayor Robinson.
I was struck by the difference in the data over a 20-year period versus the last 3-year period. And we're talking about things like a job housing balance. How are we going to know what the tipping point is and when we've reached it? And is there a way that we can be collecting data more often and analyzing it so we can see where we are in reaching our objectives?
Well, the second part of the question is easy because, yes, we're collecting all the time, and we'll try to report it to you on at least annual basis. One of our big objectives is trying to get that data out to the public and our boards on a continuous basis as we get new census data, new other types of data. So, yes, constantly monitoring, looking at different metrics. And our group had a great discussion. Kind of the key metrics it looked at was travel time, housing affordability, and environmental protection. And so we may be able to even fine tune how do we track and adjust those metrics. The question about which trend's the right trend to look at, I mean I think we end up looking at both. It's probably the cop out a little bit of we don't know what is the last 3 years the way that we're going to be moving for the next 10. Or is the last 3 years one of those kind of ups and downs along a long-term trend that's going to be more gradual? It's something we can all weigh in on.
I love the idea of having a dashboard that we almost memorize, if you will, just like we memorize the unemployment rate as we're tracking the implementation of vision. So percentage of the three that you just mentioned, right? Percentage of folks who are cost burdened and the other two that you mentioned. I think my group, not to speak for my group, but I think my group might add to that dashboard, not to make it too long, but vehicle miles traveled and some sort of indicator to see if we're putting jobs, if people are living closer to where they work. whether that's VMT or some other indicator. It came up a lot.
Okay, so I guess overall I'm hearing general interest in the preliminary concepts, maybe looking at other ways to look at infrastructure and whether there's another way to sort of think about it just beyond high capacity transit, but certainly interest in sort of a more nuanced look at urban unincorporated. So we will continue to work on this over the summer and talk to staff committee as well, and we will have another chance to talk about it certainly in September. But sounds like good direction here.
Can I add something? Sorry, Liz, to jump in, but I want to know, on the urban unincorporated, we'll specifically be following up with the county staff, because it's their area. The concept of having a more nuance makes a lot of sense from a planning aspect. It also has potential implications for how the future round of setting targets for those areas at your countywide levels. So we want to make sure that we get into enough nuance and detail that it works for you here at the regional level, but still works for you at the countywide level.
Great.
Councilmember Young?
Thank you, Chairman. Just one thing to just kind of, because I think it gets lost what that means a little bit. And I just want to point out, so in terms of urban unincorporated area, we get this allocation that's for the entire area. And that means the far north end of Gig Harbor, where I live, which is on the Kitsap border and close to the most rural parts of the county. And then on the other side in Parkland, where you have this rather large, urban, very city-looking kind of area community. Further fine-tuning that means that we no longer treat that as all one area, which doesn't make much sense. So I just want, we're not talking about specific, like, you know, this chunk here. It's actually the entirety of the urban unincorporated area outside of your cities. So in some cases, that may mean significant changes so that it reflects more what your community will look like.
Right. And one thing I'd observe is that right now, some counties in doing that, I guess, sub-allocation of targets in urban unincorporated areas look at potential annexation areas, areas that are currently affiliated with individual cities, with a larger share of that urban unincorporated share of the county's growth than areas that aren't affiliated with particular jurisdictions or aren't identified for either incorporation or annexation. So it's that type of approach, I think, is an example of how you would divide up a look at an urban unincorporated area.
Deputy Mayor Robinson, did you want to? Councilmember Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question I wanted to ask regarding annexations and whatnot. So you have, we're talking about, in the past, we've talked about incentives for cities to annex their UGAs and whatnot. Shouldn't part of that be understanding what the impact of the counties are as well? And do we take that into consideration? Is there a way to measure that?
To respond, I would say right now in the policies in Vision 2040, Vision 2040 talks about a vision for 2040 that all of that unincorporated urban area would be annexed or incorporated by that time. Doesn't specifically talk much about what does that mean then for the county in terms of its tax base and its responsibilities and so forth. And clearly there are implications. So it's something that should be up for discussion as we look at those policies and talk about those areas. Yeah.
Okay, so just in terms of next steps, over the summer, we're going to continue discussion with staff committee and continue doing some work internally on developing some concepts for what some of the alternatives or scenarios could look like for alternatives, and developing evaluation measures of those based on what some of the objectives that we've talked about today. So we're going to continue to do some technical prep too, in terms of some of our modeling prep on our no action alternative, which I think we've pretty well have at least defined, and we will be working on a background paper to help summarize some of the data that we've all been talking about and hearing about to try to consolidate it into one place. And yeah, we will be doing some preparations for the September board working session where we'll be able to talk a little bit more about scenario concepts and what we want to be looking like for the future.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, staff, for preparing so well so we could use our time wisely and have thoughtful discussion together. And thank you, everyone, for your engagement today. It's really meaningful. I'm going to encourage you to think about not partying too hard on July 4th. Our next meeting is July 5th, and we have a full agenda. It's another extended meeting, so hopefully that's reflected on your calendars, 10 to 1 on July the 5th. Among the big focus is going to be an extended work session like today, but focused on the topic of housing, which I know is terribly important to all of us. So with that, have a happy 4th and a safe 4th, and we'll see you then, and we stand adjourned.